blind, frail horse is brought into a vet clinic, abandoned and seemingly out of chances. The vet prepares for the heartbreaking task of putting him down, until she notices something unusual around his neck. What she finds changes everything, sending her on a journey to uncover a past filled with heartbreak, heroism, and a forgotten legacy. Who is this horse? And what secret does his collar hold? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The storm rattled the windows of Pine Grove Veterinary Clinic as Julia rubbed her tired eyes. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., and her body ached from the long shift. Empty coffee cups littered her desk, evidence of the marathon day she'd endured. Thunder cracked overhead as she gathered her files. The quiet hum of medical equipment and soft whimpers from the recovery kennels were familiar companions during these late nights. Just as she reached for her keys, the front door burst open with a bang that made her jump. Wind and rain whipped through the entrance, along with Ben, the local animal control officer. His usually neat uniform was soaked through, his gray hair plastered to his forehead. "Julia, thank goodness you're still here," he said, water dripping onto the linoleum floor. "We've got an emergency." "Ben, I was just about to—" "It's a horse," he cut in, his voice urgent. "Found him wandering by Route 7. He's blind, Julia, skin and bones. Nearly got hit by a truck." Julia's shoulders slumped. Her clinic was already stretched thin with 3 recovering dogs and a pair of injured cats. But the look in Ben's eyes told her this wasn't a request she could refuse. "Bring him in," she sighed, already reaching for fresh gloves. Minutes later, the horse appeared in the doorway, led by 2 of Ben's colleagues. Julia's heart sank at the sight. The animal was a ghost of what a horse should be, ribs protruding sharply, hip bones jutting out like harsh mountains. His coat, what remained of it, hung in patchy clumps. "His name's Apollo," Ben said softly. "Found his old registration tag." Julia approached slowly, speaking in gentle tones. Apollo's head turned toward her voice, but his eyes, clouded and unseeing, stared past her. Old scars marked his face and flanks, telling stories of neglect she didn't want to imagine. As she ran her hands over his body, doing an initial exam, her mind wrestled with the inevitable decision she might have to make. His muscles were wasted, his hooves overgrown. The kind thing might be to end his suffering. But something made her hesitate. Despite his condition, Apollo stood quietly, his ears moving to track every sound. There was a dignity about him, even in his broken state. "Let's get him settled for the night," she said finally. "The padded stall in the back should work." Ben helped her lead Apollo to the stall, which they quickly lined with fresh bedding. The horse's breathing was labored, each breath a wheezing effort that echoed in the quiet clinic. After Ben left, Julia pulled up a chair outside Apollo's stall. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside, the clinic had returned to its late-night quiet. She watched as Apollo slowly lowered himself to the bedding, his thin frame shuddering with the effort. "What happened to you?" she whispered, watching his chest rise and fall. Sleep was impossible now. She couldn't leave him, not tonight. Tomorrow would bring hard decisions, but for now, she would keep vigil, wondering about the life this broken creature had lived. Morning light filtered through the clinic windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Julia's neck ached from sleeping in the chair, but her first thought was of Apollo. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fresh, rain-washed world. She approached Apollo's stall with fresh water and bandages. The old horse lifted his head at the sound of her footsteps, his clouded eyes turning in her direction. Despite his condition, there was an alertness about him that tugged at her heart. "Good morning, boy," she said softly, entering the stall. Apollo remained still as she began her examination, documenting each injury and concern. His coat was matted with mud and debris, requiring gentle cleaning to assess the true extent of his condition. As Julia worked around his neck, her fingers caught on something beneath the tangles. Carefully parting the matted hair, she found a weathered leather strap, so worn it almost blended with his coat. It wasn't a proper halter, more like a collar that had somehow survived whatever ordeal Apollo had endured. "What's this?" she murmured, cleaning away the grime. Her fingers traced raised letters in the leather, faded but still legible. "If found, return to Haven Ridge. He saved me once." Julia sat back on her heels, studying Apollo's face. The euthanasia form sat unsigned on her desk, but this discovery made her pause. There was a story here, one that needed to be told. Between appointments, Julia searched online for Haven Ridge. The results were sparse, just a few old newspaper articles and defunct website links. One article caught her eye. "Local Animal Sanctuary Lost in Tragic Fire." The story, dated 12 years ago, described Haven Ridge as a sanctuary for abused and abandoned animals. The facility had burned down in a devastating fire, and after that, the trail went cold. Throughout the day, Julia found her thoughts returning to the mystery. She watched as Apollo weekly accepted small amounts of feed, his body so unused to proper nutrition that she had to be careful not to overwhelm his system. As evening settled in, Julia finished her rounds and returned to Apollo's stall. The horse nickered softly as she approached, a sound that surprised and delighted her. She reached out to stroke his nose, noticing how he leaned ever so slightly into her touch. "You're quite the mystery, aren't you?" she said quietly, watching him eat the last of his evening meal. "Let's figure out your story, big guy." Outside, the last remnants of the storm drained away into storm gutters and creek beds. The night settled into a peaceful quiet, broken only by the gentle sounds of Apollo's breathing. Julia's fingers flew across her keyboard late into the evening, searching for any information about Haven Ridge. The clinic was quiet except for the hum of her computer and Apollo's occasional soft nickering from his stall. Her persistence finally paid off when she found an archived news article from 15 years ago. "Haven Ridge, a new beginning for broken spirits," the headline read. The article detailed how Emma Grayson, a celebrated animal advocate, had transformed an old farm into a sanctuary for abused and neglected animals. Emma's philosophy was simple but powerful. Every animal deserved a second chance at life. Julia's heart sank as she read further. A more recent article described the devastating fire that had claimed both the sanctuary and Emma's life. The details were sparse, but the loss had clearly left a hole in the community that was never filled. The next morning, Julia packed Apollo's worn collar in her bag and followed the directions to Haven Ridge. Her old truck bumped along a narrow dirt road until she spotted a weathered wooden sign, its letters barely visible beneath years of exposure. The sanctuary's remains stood like a forgotten memory. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete, and vines crawled up the walls of dilapidated buildings. The main house's windows were dark, empty sockets, and the roof had partially caved in. Julia's footsteps echoed as she walked carefully through the grounds, broken glass and debris crunching beneath her boots. The barn stood apart from the other buildings, its red paint faded to a dull rust color. The door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking in the light breeze. Inside, shafts of sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing dust motes. Old hay still littered the floor, and empty stalls lined the walls. Something caught Julia's eye in one of the stalls, a small metal box partially hidden under old straw. She brushed away the debris and opened it carefully. Inside, protected from the worst of the weather, she found several photographs. Most were too damaged to make out, but one remained relatively intact. The image showed a young woman with kind eyes and a bright smile, her arms wrapped around the neck of a magnificent horse. The horse stood proud and tall, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes clear and bright. Julia turned the photo over with trembling fingers and read the faded writing, "Apollo, my guardian." She held the photograph up to the light streaming through the barn's broken roof. Despite the years of neglect and illness that had transformed him, the horse in the photo was unmistakably Apollo. The same distinctive white marking ran down his face, and even his stance was similar. "Is this you?" she whispered, studying the image. The setting sun caught the edges of the photograph, making the happy scene glow with warm light. Julia carefully tucked the photo into her pocket and headed back to her truck, her mind racing with questions about Apollo's connection to Emma and Haven Ridge. That evening, the clinic's fluorescent lights hummed softly as Julia spread the water-damaged photograph on her desk. Ben leaned in closer, adjusting his glasses to get a better look. "I found this at Haven Ridge today," Julia explained, pointing to the young woman in the photo. "That's Emma Grayson with Apollo." Ben's eyes widened with recognition. "I remember when Haven Ridge closed. It hit the town hard." He shook his head slowly. Emma was doing amazing work there. People would bring her the most desperate cases, animals nobody else would take. Somehow, she always found a way to help them. Julia watched Apollo through the office window as he dozed in his stall. "Do you remember anything else about her or the sanctuary?" "I was pretty new to animal control back then," Ben said, his voice soft with memory. "But I remember how that place gave people hope. When it burned down, it left a huge gap. Nobody ever stepped up to fill Emma's shoes." The next morning, Julia drove her truck down a winding country road to the Calloway farm. The old farmhouse stood weathered but proud, with cheerful flower boxes decorating the windows. Mrs. Calloway, a small woman with silver hair and kind eyes, welcomed Julia onto her wide front porch. "Emma Grayson?" Mrs. Calloway's face lit up at the mention of the name. "Oh, she was something special. Moved here about 20 years ago with nothing but determination and a dream." The older woman settled into her rocking chair, her hands folded in her lap. "She turned that old Matthews place into a real sanctuary. Called it Haven Ridge, because she said every animal deserved a safe haven." Julia pulled out the photograph, and Mrs. Calloway's eyes misted over. "That's Apollo," she said softly. "Emma's pride and joy. She found him half dead in a drainage ditch during a storm. Nursed him back to health herself." Mrs. Calloway leaned forward in her chair. "But there was something special about that horse. Emma swore he could sense when other animals were in distress. He'd get restless, pace his stall until she checked on them. Found quite a few sick animals that way before it was too late." Her voice grew thick with emotion as she continued. "The night of the fire, Emma had gotten most of the animals out, but Apollo was trapped in the barn. She went back in for him." Mrs. Calloway wiped at her eyes with a tissue. "They found her, but Apollo disappeared. Some folks thought he died in the woods. Others said someone took him in. Never knew for sure what happened to him." Julia reached out and squeezed Mrs. Calloway's hand gently. "Thank you for telling me about them. It helps me understand Apollo better and Emma's work at Haven Ridge." Mrs. Calloway patted Julia's hand. "Emma would be glad to know he's being cared for again. That horse meant everything to her." Back at the clinic, Julia spread her notes across her desk, creating a timeline of Haven Ridge's history. Her fingers traced the edges of the water-damaged photograph, studying Emma's bright smile and Apollo's proud stance. The horse in the image looked so different from the skeletal creature in her care, but his gentle spirit remained unchanged. She opened her laptop, cross-referencing names from old newspaper clippings with current addresses. Several longtime residents still lived within a few miles of the former sanctuary. Julia grabbed her keys, determined to piece together more of Apollo's story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Julia drove from farm to farm. Most conversations ended quickly, shifted gazes, mumbled excuses, and closed doors. The tragedy of Haven Ridge seemed to have left deep wounds in the town that hadn't fully healed. At her fourth stop, Mr. Avery's weathered farmhouse, she finally found someone willing to talk. The elderly man sat in his workshop, hands weathered from decades of working the land. "Apollo?" he said, setting down the bridle he was repairing. "That poor creature. Some folks around here didn't understand him after the fire." Mr. Avery's voice grew heavy. "Emma always said he was special, but once he went blind..." He shook his head slowly. "People can be cruel when they don't understand something. Some said it would have been kinder to put him down. Others just turned their backs, didn't want the burden of a blind horse." Julia's hands clenched into fists as she listened. The thought of Apollo being abandoned, left to wander alone for years, made her chest tight with anger. The drive home felt longer than usual as Julia processed everything she'd learned. Her emotions swirled. Rage at the callousness of those who'd abandoned Apollo, sadness for his suffering, and a growing determination to prove his worth. As she pulled into her driveway, the setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Apollo stood quietly in the paddock, his ears swiveling toward the sound of her car. Despite everything he'd endured, he remained gentle and trusting. "We'll figure this out," she said softly, watching him through her car window. Her resolve strengthened with each beat of her heart. The next morning dawned gray and dreary, with rain clouds gathering overhead. Julia pulled up to Mrs. Calloway's farmhouse, her windshield wipers sweeping away the first droplets of rain. The elderly woman welcomed her with a warm smile and ushered her into a kitchen that smelled of fresh-baked bread and coffee. "I made some chamomile tea," Mrs. Calloway said, setting down 2 steaming mugs on the worn wooden table. "Seems fitting for a day like this." Julia wrapped her hands around the warm mug, watching the rain streak down the kitchen windows. "Could you tell me more about the night of the fire?" she asked gently. Mrs. Calloway's weathered hands trembled slightly as she settled into her chair. "It was a terrible winter storm," she began, her voice soft but clear. "The kind that makes the windows rattle. Emma was doing her evening checks in the barn. She never missed them, no matter the weather." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "The lightning, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. One moment everything was normal. The next..." Mrs. Calloway's eyes grew distant. "The barn went up so fast. People came running from everywhere to help. We got most of the animals out. But Emma..." Her voice cracked. "She wouldn't leave Apollo behind," Mrs. Calloway continued. "He was panicking," they said. "The smoke and noise. It was too much for him. Emma, she just kept going back in the barn." She stopped, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. It collapsed before she could make it out. Julia sat in respectful silence, her own tea growing cold. "We found Apollo 3 days later," Mrs. Calloway said. "He was in the woods, hurt and scared. His eyes..." She shook her head sadly. "The smoke and heat damaged them beyond repair. But he survived, thanks to Emma." Mrs. Calloway reached across the table, placing her hand over Julia's. "Emma always said Apollo had a purpose. Maybe he's found it again, with you." The drive back to the clinic felt heavy with the weight of Mrs. Calloway's words. As evening settled in, Julia sat in Apollo's paddock, the grass damp beneath her. Above, stars began to peek through breaks in the clouds. She ran her fingers through Apollo's coarse mane, thinking about Emma's sacrifice and the deep bond she must have shared with this gentle giant. In the quiet of the night, Julia made a silent promise to honor Emma's memory and ensure Apollo's remaining years would be filled with the love and care he deserved. Over the next few weeks, Apollo's recovery showed promising signs. His ribs were less visible beneath his dull coat, and his appetite grew stronger with each passing day. Julia noticed how he lifted his head a little higher during their daily health checks, and his breathing became less labored. One mild evening, as Julia led Apollo on their usual walk around the paddock, she noticed something that made her pause. A figure stood at the edge of her property, partially hidden behind an old oak tree. The man's dark clothing made him hard to spot in the fading light, but his presence was unmistakable. When Julia turned to look directly at him, he quickly disappeared into the shadows. Her heart hammering, Julia guided Apollo back to his stable. She double-checked all the locks before heading inside to call Ben. "A stranger watching the property?" Ben's voice crackled through the phone. "That's concerning. Did you get a good look at him?" "No," Julia replied, pacing her office. "He left as soon as he saw me watching." "Listen," Ben said, his tone serious. "We should set up some security measures. I can help you install cameras tomorrow, and motion lights would be a good idea too." Julia nodded, even though Ben couldn't see her. "Yes, please. I'd feel better knowing we have some extra protection." The next day, Ben arrived with equipment and spent several hours installing security cameras at strategic points around the clinic and paddock. He showed Julia how to access the feed on her phone and helped her position motion-activated lights that would illuminate any nighttime visitors. "This should help deter any unwanted guests," Ben said as he finished mounting the last camera. That night, as Julia made her final rounds, she found Apollo acting strangely. His ears swiveled back and forth, and his nostrils flared as he tested the air. Despite her gentle reassurances, he remained agitated, shifting restlessly in his stall. Julia pulled up a stool and sat beside him, speaking in soft, soothing tones. "We're safe," she whispered, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She stayed with him, stroking his neck until his nervous movements finally settled. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over them both. The morning sun was bright across the paddock as Julia watched Apollo with growing amazement. The skeletal, fearful horse she'd first met was transforming before her eyes. Though still blind, Apollo moved with increasing confidence, his hooves finding sure footing as he explored his surroundings. "That's it, boy," Julia encouraged as Apollo navigated around a water trough without hesitation. His ears swiveled toward her voice, and he nickered softly in response. Inspired by his progress, Julia gathered some basic equipment, traffic cones and poles she'd borrowed from a neighboring farm. She arranged them in a simple pattern, creating a gentle obstacle course. With steady hands on his lead rope, she guided Apollo through the course, speaking to him in clear, calm tones. "Step right," she directed, and Apollo responded with remarkable precision. His trust in her voice grew stronger each day, their connection deepening through these exercises. Over the next few days, Julia established a routine. Mornings began with basic exercises, followed by grooming sessions where Apollo stood perfectly still, seeming to enjoy the attention. His coat, though still dull, began showing hints of its former luster. During their sessions, Julia noticed how he anticipated her movements, shifting his weight before she even gave commands. Between caring for Apollo and her regular clinic duties, Julia continued researching Haven Ridge. She discovered old newspaper clippings praising Emma's work. One article described how the sanctuary had helped rehabilitate abused show horses. Another told the story of a therapy program Emma had started for local children with disabilities. "You were part of something special," Julia murmured to Apollo one afternoon, running her hands along his neck. "Emma created quite a legacy." That evening, after finishing Apollo's dinner routine, Julia headed to her office to complete some paperwork. A plain white envelope sat on her desk, unmarked except for the clinic's address. No return address, no postmark. Julia's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with typed words. "Apollo's story isn't over. Keep digging. Ridge Guardian." She read the note several times, her mind racing with questions. Who was the Ridge Guardian? And what did they know about Apollo's past? She walked to the window, watching Apollo's calm figure in the paddock, the mystery of his story deeper than ever. The note felt both encouraging and unsettling. Someone out there knew more about Apollo, about Haven Ridge, about what had really happened. Julia carefully placed the letter in her desk drawer, her determination to uncover the truth growing stronger. Julia sat at her desk, turning the mysterious note over in her hands for the 100th time that morning. The typed words seemed to mock her with their vagueness. Apollo's story isn't over. Keep digging. Ridge Guardian. She'd spent hours wondering about the sender's identity and their connection to Haven Ridge. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. Through the window, she watched a blue sedan park in the clinic's driveway. A man in his early 30s, wearing jeans and a worn denim jacket, stepped out. His sandy hair and familiar features tugged at her memory. She'd seen a face like his before, in the old newspaper clippings. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. "Dr. Merrick, I'm Daniel Grayson, Emma's brother." Julia's heart skipped a beat. "Please, come in. Would you like some coffee?" They settled in her small office, steam rising from their mugs. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he held his cup. "I've been following Apollo's story since Ben found him. I needed time to work up the courage to come here." "You sent the note," Julia said softly. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "The Ridge Guardian, it was Emma's nickname in the local papers." He took a shaky breath. "I was only 16 when the fire happened. Too young to take over the sanctuary, though I wanted to. Our cousin Clara inherited everything instead." Julia leaned forward. "Clara?" "Clara Grayson. She never shared Emma's passion for animals. The land's just been sitting there, falling apart." Daniel's voice carried years of regret. "I thought about reaching out to Clara so many times. But, well, family dynamics are complicated. She distanced herself from anything related to Haven Ridge after Emma died." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "This is Clara's contact information. Maybe you'll have better luck than I did. There's something about you. The way you've helped Apollo, your dedication. It reminds me of Emma." Daniel stood and walked to the window overlooking the paddock where Apollo grazed peacefully. "Would it be all right if I—" "Of course," Julia said, leading him outside. Apollo lifted his head as they approached, his ears pricking forward. Daniel stopped at the fence, tears welling in his eyes as he watched the blind horse. "Emma always said he was meant for something bigger," he said quietly. "She believed in him so much." Julia placed her hand on the fence. "I promise to do everything I can to fulfill that vision." Julia's fingers hovered over her phone the next morning, Daniel's business card propped against her coffee mug. Taking a deep breath, she dialed Clara's number. "Hello?" a crisp voice answered. "Ms. Grayson, this is Dr. Julia Merrick. I'm calling about Haven Ridge Sanctuary." There was a long pause. "How did you get this number?" "Your cousin Daniel gave it to me. I'm caring for Apollo, Emma's horse. He was found recently and—" "Apollo? Clara's voice wavered slightly before hardening again. That was all a lifetime ago, Dr. Merrick. The sanctuary is a lost cause. Please, just hear me out, Julia pressed. Apollo's survival means something. Would you consider visiting the property before making any final decisions? I have my own life now, Clara said firmly. The past should stay in the past. Despite Clara's resistance, Julia persisted. Just one visit. That's all I'm asking. After another long silence, Clara sighed. I'll think about it. Over the next few days, Julia threw herself into working with Apollo. His recovery amazed her. Each day brought small victories. His coat began to shine, and though his eyes remained clouded, he moved with growing confidence. One sunny afternoon, Julia decided to take Apollo on a longer walk down the quiet road near the clinic. The old horse matched his pace to hers, his hooves clip-clopping steadily on the pavement. As they rounded a bend, they encountered a weathered pickup truck parked on the shoulder. A man in work clothes leaned against it, his eyes fixed on Apollo. I can't believe it's really him, the man said, his voice rough with emotion. Julia pulled Apollo to a gentle stop. Did you know him? The man nodded, pushing away from his truck. Name's Greg. I worked at Haven Ridge back when Emma... He trailed off, looking down at his boots. I was there the night of the fire. Helped get most of the animals out, but Apollo... His voice cracked. I left him. Thought a blind horse wouldn't make it anyway. Julia watched Greg's face contort with old pain. You've carried that for a long time, haven't you? Never stopped thinking about him, Greg admitted. Every time I drove past that old place, I wondered if I could have done more. Julia studied Greg's genuine remorse, an idea forming. Would you like to help with his care now? It's never too late to make things right. Greg's eyes widened, then darted away. I don't know if I deserve that chance. Just think about it, Julia said gently. Apollo could use more people in his corner. Greg nodded slowly. Maybe I could stop by sometime. There's a lot about Haven Ridge that needs to be said. That evening, Julia settled into her office chair, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands as she reviewed the security camera footage. The screens cast a blue glow across her tired face while she clicked through hours of recordings. Her breath caught when she spotted movement at the edge of one frame, a dark figure lingering near the tree line. Try as she might, she couldn't make out any distinguishing features in the grainy footage. This isn't good, she muttered, rewinding the clip several times. The figure appeared to be watching the paddock, but the angle and distance made it impossible to identify them. The next morning, Julia shared her concerns with Ben over coffee at the clinic. I can't shake the feeling something's not right, she said, showing him the footage on her laptop. Ben leaned forward, frowning at the screen. Keep your phone on you at all times, he advised, his usually cheerful face serious. And maybe we should set up some additional cameras with better resolution. You think I'm right to be worried? Better safe than sorry, Ben replied, straightening up. I'll drive by more often during my rounds. That night, Julia jolted awake to the sound of something metallic clattering near the paddock. Her heart hammered as she grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table. The beam cut through the darkness as she made her way outside, scanning the area around Apollo's enclosure. Nothing seemed out of place. Apollo stood calmly by the fence, his ears pricked forward but showing no signs of distress. Julia checked the gates and fencing, all secure. Still, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Someone was watching. She could feel it. The next morning, Julia's hands shook slightly as she dialed Clara's number again. To her surprise, Clara answered on the second ring. I've been thinking about what you said, Clara said before Julia could speak. I'll come see the property on Friday. Julia's spirits lifted despite her lingering unease. Thank you, Clara. What time works best for you? They arranged the details, but even as Julia hung up, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was working against her. She glanced out her office window toward the tree line where the figure had been spotted, wondering what secrets still lurked in Haven Ridge's shadows. The morning sun cast long shadows across Haven Ridge as Clara's silver SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. Julia stood waiting, her heart beating a little faster as Emma's cousin stepped out of the vehicle. Clara was dressed in crisp business attire, her expression guarded as she surveyed the overgrown property. "It's different than I remembered," Clara said softly, her heels crunching on the gravel. Julia led her through the grounds, carefully navigating around fallen branches and twisted metal. Clara's eyes grew wet as they approached the burned-out shell of the main barn. "It's hard to see it like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Despite Julia's gentle prompting, Clara remained noncommittal about the property's future, her responses careful and measured. After Clara departed, Julia decided to take Apollo for his afternoon walk. The air was heavy with the scent of wild honeysuckle as they made their way along the property line. Suddenly, Apollo's demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward and he began to whine, pulling Julia toward the old gate with unexpected strength. "Easy, boy," Julia soothed, but Apollo was insistent. He pawed at the ground near a specific spot, his behavior growing more agitated. Julia studied the area, noticing that the soil looked different, slightly disturbed, as if it had been dug up and replaced. Following her instincts, she returned to her truck for a small shovel she kept for emergencies. The earth gave way easily under her tool. About a foot down, her shovel struck something solid. Julia's hands trembled as she brushed away the dirt, revealing a rusted metal box about the size of a shoebox. Inside, protected by plastic, she found a treasure trove of memories. Blue ribbons from horse shows, carefully preserved photographs, and most precious of all, Emma's personal journal. The pages were filled with detailed observations about Apollo's remarkable ability to sense danger and comfort other animals. One entry caught Julia's eye. Apollo knew about the snake before anyone else did. His warning saved that little filly's life. There's something special about him. He's not just a horse, he's a guardian. Julia sat back on her heels, clutching the journal to her chest. The pieces of Apollo's story were finally coming together, and with them, Emma's vision for Haven Ridge became clearer than ever. Even if Clara chose not to help, Julia knew she had to restore the sanctuary. She owed it to Emma, to Apollo, and to all the animals who might find refuge here. The autumn night wrapped around Julia like a cool blanket as she sat on her weathered porch, Emma's journal open in her lap. The lantern beside her cast a warm glow across the pages, illuminating Emma's neat handwriting. Each entry revealed more about the woman who had built Haven Ridge from nothing but hope and determination. "Today we welcome Sarah, a troubled teen who's been struggling at home," Julia read aloud softly. "She spent an hour with Apollo, and for the first time in weeks, her mother saw her smile. These moments remind me why we need this place. It's not just about saving animals, it's about healing hearts." Julia's fingers traced the words, feeling the slight indentations in the paper. Entry after entry showed Emma's vision. A sanctuary where broken spirits, both animal and human, could find their way back to wholeness. The journal spoke of rescue stories, small victories, and countless moments of connection between hurting people and healing animals. As the crickets chirped their evening song, Julia's mind wandered to Apollo. Despite his blindness and years of hardship, he remained gentle and trusting. His quiet strength had already changed her, showing her what resilience truly meant. The next morning, Julia called Clara, her hand slightly shaking as she held the phone. "I found Emma's journal," she said, describing the buried box and its contents. "Clara, she had such beautiful plans for this place." There was a long pause on the other end. I remember how passionate she was," Clara finally responded, her voice tight with emotion. "But running a sanctuary takes more than dreams, Julia. It needs money, community support, proper planning." "I know," Julia said. "Give me a chance to prove it can work. Let me try to rebuild what Emma started." After several moments of silence, Clara sighed. "If you can show me there's enough interest, if you can prove it's viable, I'll support you." That evening, Julia gathered her small group of volunteers in her living room. Ben sat in her old armchair, while Greg perched nervously on the edge of the couch. They listened intently as she shared Emma's journal entries and her vision for Haven Ridge's future. "We're going to rebuild Haven Ridge," Julia announced, standing tall despite her racing heart. "It won't be easy, but I believe we can do this together." Ben leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "Count me in. I've seen too many animals with nowhere to go." Greg nodded slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Maybe this is how I make things right." Looking at their determined faces, Julia felt a surge of hope. They were few in number, but their commitment was strong. Together, they would bring Emma's dream back to life. Julia started her day early, clutching Emma's journal as she drove from farm to farm in her dusty pickup truck. The morning sun painted the countryside in soft golden hues as she shared Apollo's story and her vision for Haven Ridge's revival. At Miller's feed store, old Mr. Miller shook his head. "It's a nice thought, dear, but that's a mighty big project," he said, adjusting his worn baseball cap. "Costs alone would be astronomical." Similar responses greeted her at other stops. The local pet shop owner listened politely, but offered only a non-committal, "I'll think about it." At the county animal shelter, the director expressed concern about competing for limited donation dollars. Refusing to let the skepticism discourage her, Julia transformed her clinic's waiting room into a makeshift exhibition space. She hung photos from Emma's journal on the walls and arranged chairs in neat rows. Apollo stood quietly in a temporary paddock just outside the large windows, his presence commanding attention despite his thin frame. The open house began slowly, with just a few curious neighbors trickling in. But as word spread, more people arrived. Mrs. Calloway brought her grandchildren, who pressed their faces against the window to watch Apollo. Former volunteers from Haven Ridge's glory days shared stories, their eyes misty with memories. Julia stood before the growing crowd, her voice steady as she presented Emma's vision. "Haven Ridge wasn't just about saving animals," she explained, gesturing to the photographs. "It was about creating a place where healing happened on both sides of the fence." The atmosphere in the room shifted as she spoke. People leaned forward in their chairs, nodding. When she described Apollo's journey from the fire to his recent rescue, several attendees wiped away tears. "I'd like to volunteer," announced a teenage girl, raising her hand. "My mom says this place helped my aunt years ago." Others followed suit. A local contractor offered to assess the property. A retired accountant volunteered to help with budgeting. People wrote checks, signed up for volunteer shifts, and promised to spread the word. As the crowd began to thin, Greg approached Julia. His weathered face showed signs of nervous determination. "I want to help," he said quietly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Working with Apollo these past few days, it reminded me why I loved this work in the first place." Julia saw the sincerity in his eyes, the hope mixed with lingering guilt. "We could use your experience," she replied warmly, touching his arm. "Welcome back to Haven Ridge." Greg's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. Behind them, Apollo nickered softly, as if adding his own approval to the moment. The morning dew still clung to the tall grass as Julia's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway of Haven Ridge. Behind her, a small convoy of vehicles carried volunteers, their headlights cutting through the early morning mist. Greg's old pickup brought up the rear, loaded with tools and supplies. Julia stepped out of her truck, work boots crunching on the gravel. The sanctuary's main building loomed before them, its weathered boards and sagging roof a testament to years of neglect. But where others might have seen decay, Julia saw possibility. "All right, everyone," she called out as the volunteers gathered around. "Let's start with the basics, clearing paths and checking structures." The team spread out across the property, armed with pruning shears, work gloves, and determination. Greg led a small group to tackle the barn roof, while others attacked the aggressive weeds that had claimed the paddocks. The sound of clipping, hammering, and friendly chatter filled the air. By midday, the transformation was already visible. Clear paths emerged where thick undergrowth had been, and fresh lumber replaced rotted fence posts. Inside the barn, Greg climbed into the dusty loft to assess the structural damage. His boot knocked against something solid, an old trunk, its leather straps cracked with age. "Julia," he called down, "you might want to see this." Together, they opened the trunk, discovering bundles of letters and photographs. Julia's hands trembled as she unfolded the first letter, reading aloud. "Dear Emma, Tiger has brought so much joy to our family. My daughter's nightmares stopped the day we brought him home." Letter after letter told similar stories of healing, hope, and second chances. Photos showed smiling families with their adopted animals, each image a testament to Emma's vision. "We should display these," Julia said softly, running her finger along a faded photograph. "Create a memory wall right here in the barn. Show everyone what Haven Ridge meant to people." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. The barn's roof got patched, weeds were cleared, and fences straightened. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, the volunteers gathered outside the barn to admire their work. Apollo stood in the newly cleared paddock nearby, his ears forward and alert. A soft whinny escaped him, drawing everyone's attention. Julia smiled, watching as the old horse seemed to survey their progress with approval. The volunteers, though exhausted, wore proud expressions as they looked at what they'd accomplished. In just one day, Haven Ridge had begun to emerge from its years of abandonment. The memory wall would soon tell its story, and new chapters waited to be written. The morning sun cast long shadows across Haven Ridge as Clara Grayson's silver sedan pulled up to the sanctuary. Julia and Greg stood waiting, both trying to hide their nervousness as Emma's cousin stepped out of her car. Clara's crisp business attire seemed out of place among the work boots and dusty grounds. "You've been busy," Clara remarked, surveying the cleared paths and repaired fencing. Julia nodded, leading the way toward the barn. "We've made good progress this week. The roof is patched, and we've started renovating the interior." Greg opened the barn doors, revealing the freshly swept floors and organized workspace. Sunlight streamed through the newly replaced windows, illuminating the half-finished memory wall where photos and letters had been carefully arranged. "These are the treatment areas we're planning," Julia explained, gesturing to marked-off sections. "And over here will be recovery stalls for injured animals." Clara walked slowly through the space, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "This was Emma's dream," she said, turning to face Julia. "Why are you so invested? You never even knew her." Julia took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. "When Apollo came into my life, I saw something special in him. Despite everything he's been through, the fire, being abandoned, going blind, he still has this incredible capacity to help others. She led Clara to the memory wall. Just like these stories show how Emma's work changed lives, Apollo showed me that healing goes both ways. Sometimes in helping others, we find our own purpose. Greg stepped forward, adding softly, I've seen it myself. Working with Apollo these past weeks, it's brought back everything good about this place. Clara stood before the memory wall, reading letter after letter. Her professional facade cracked slightly as she touched a photograph showing Emma with a group of children and their therapy horses. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of Apollo's soft nickering from his paddock. Finally, Clara turned to Julia. I can offer you a 2-year lease on the property, she said. But the sanctuary needs to be self-sustaining by then. I won't fund a failing dream. We'll make it work, Julia promised. Emma's vision was solid. We just need to update it for today's needs. Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful as she walked toward her car. At the last moment, she paused, looking over at Apollo grazing peacefully in his paddock. Maybe this place does deserve a second chance, she said quietly, before sliding into her car and driving away. The morning air held a crisp bite as Julia and her team bustled around Haven Ridge's newly renovated barn. Greg checked the stall bedding one last time, while 2 volunteers, Sarah and Mike, organized feed buckets and medical supplies. Julia's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her checklist. This was the moment they'd been working toward. Transport's here, Greg called from the doorway. A white trailer rumbled up the gravel driveway, carrying Haven Ridge's first new residents. 2 severely undernourished ponies and an abandoned donkey from a nearby foreclosed farm. Julia's heart raced with equal parts excitement and worry. Okay, everyone remember the protocol. Slow movements, quiet voices, she reminded the team, though her own voice quivered with anticipation. The trailer doors opened to reveal 3 pairs of frightened eyes. The ponies, 1 bay and 1 dappled gray, huddled together, their ribs clearly visible beneath matted coats. The donkey, a scruffy brown fellow, began braying loudly the moment he saw people approaching. Easy there, big guy, Greg murmured, carefully leading the agitated donkey down the ramp. The animal's distressed calls echoed through the morning air, causing the ponies to stamp nervously in the trailer. From his paddock nearby, Apollo lifted his head, ears pricked forward at the commotion. As the team worked to guide the new arrivals into their stalls, Julia noticed something remarkable. Each time they passed Apollo's paddock, the animals seemed to settle, their anxious movements becoming less frantic. Would you look at that? Sarah whispered, watching as the donkey's braying subsided to occasional snuffles when near Apollo's enclosure. The morning stretched into the afternoon as they worked patiently with their new charges. Greg mixed warm mash with medication, while Julia performed thorough health checks. The ponies, though terrified, allowed her gentle touch, their eyes gradually losing their wild look. Apollo remained a steady presence throughout the day, standing near the fence like a silent guardian. His calm demeanor appeared to radiate outward, creating a peaceful atmosphere that seemed to touch every corner of the sanctuary. As evening approached, Julia gathered with her tired but satisfied team in the barn aisle. The ponies dozed in their fresh straw bedding, while the donkey munched contentedly on hay. Through the barn door, they could see Apollo, his head held high in the golden light of sunset, almost like a sentry on duty. Look at them, Greg said softly, gesturing to their new residents. Already settling in. Julia smiled, watching the peaceful scene before her. This is just the beginning, she said softly, her voice full of quiet joy. A week passed at Haven Ridge, each day bringing small victories as their new residents grew stronger. Julia stood at her mailbox one morning, shuffling through bills and advertisements, when a crisp white envelope caught her eye. Her stomach tightened as she read the official letterhead. Inside, The document detailed plans from Westbrook Development Corporation to purchase all surrounding properties, including the vital access road that led to Haven Ridge. Julia's hands shook as she read further. Without that road, the sanctuary would be completely cut off. She drove straight to Clara's house. The letter crumpled in her grip. Clara answered the door in business attire, as if she'd been expecting this confrontation. "You knew about this?" Julia asked, holding up the wrinkled paper. Clara invited her inside, gesturing to the kitchen table. "They approached me last month," she admitted, avoiding Julia's gaze. "They're offering a lot of money." Her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Clara, please," Julia said, spreading out the progress reports she'd brought. "Look at what we've accomplished in just a few weeks. The ponies have gained weight. The donkey's infection is clearing up. And Apollo." She pulled out photos of their newest rescues. "These animals are getting a second chance because of Haven Ridge." Clara studied the photos, her expression softening. "I can see you're doing good work," she said slowly, "but this is a business decision." "It's more than that," Julia insisted. "It's about honoring Emma's legacy, about keeping her dream alive." After a long moment, Clara sighed. "I'll hold off on making any decisions for now," she said. "But the sanctuary needs to prove itself quickly. Show me this can work long term." That evening, Julia gathered her team in the barn. The setting sun cast long shadows through the doors as she explained the situation. Sarah slumped against a stall door while Mike shook his head in disbelief. The silence felt heavy until Greg stepped forward. "We've come this far," he said firmly, looking around at the group. "We can't stop now. These animals need us." Julia nodded, drawing strength from his words. "We need to show everyone what Haven Ridge means to this town," she said. "I think it's time we opened our doors, really showed people what we're fighting for." "A public event," Greg suggested, his voice growing stronger. "Let them see the work we're doing." The team began to nod, their determination returning. As they discussed plans, Julia felt a flutter of hope. They had built something special here. Now they just had to make others see it too. The morning of the open house dawned bright and clear. Haven Ridge hummed with nervous energy as volunteers made final preparations. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, and fresh hay lined neat pathways between the paddocks. Julia watched from the barn doorway as the first curious families began to arrive, children pointing excitedly at the animals. Greg directed cars to the makeshift parking area in the front field, while Sarah handed out programs she'd designed featuring Apollo's story. The old barn, once dilapidated, now gleamed with fresh paint and housed educational displays about animal rescue and rehabilitation. As more people gathered near the outdoor seating area, Julia took her place at the small podium. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened Emma's journal. The crowd fell silent, eager to hear what she had to say. 10 years ago, Haven Ridge was more than just a sanctuary, Julia began, her voice growing stronger. It was a place of healing and hope. She shared stories from Emma's journal, describing the countless lives touched by the sanctuary's work. Apollo stood quietly beside her, his presence drawing whispers of amazement from the crowd. One by one, former Haven Ridge families stepped forward to share their memories. Mrs. Thompson spoke about the therapy horse that helped her daughter overcome trauma. Mr. Rodriguez described how adopting a rescued dog had brought joy back to his elderly mother's life. The local feed store owner pledged monthly hay deliveries. The hardware store offered building supplies for future renovations. Even the town's small veterinary supply company promised regular donations of medical equipment. As the afternoon drew to a close and golden sunlight bathed the property, Clara made her way through the dispersing crowd toward Julia. Her eyes were misty as she surveyed the transformed sanctuary. "You've done something incredible here," Clara said softly. Emma would have loved this. She touched Apollo's neck gently. I'm going to turn down the developer's offer. You deserve more time to make this work. Julia felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, knowing that while they still had challenges ahead, Haven Ridge had taken a crucial step toward survival. A week after the successful open house, Julia found an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. Her hand shook as she read the typed note inside. Your little sanctuary won't last long. Stay out of our way. The paper crinkled in her trembling fingers as she immediately called Ben. Within minutes, Ben's patrol car pulled up to the clinic. He studied the note with a frown, his forehead creased with concern. This has to be connected to that developer, he said, carefully placing the note in an evidence bag. They're probably not happy about Clara turning down their offer. Julia hugged herself, glancing toward the paddock where Apollo grazed peacefully. What should I do? First, we document everything, Ben replied. And I'd strongly suggest talking to a lawyer. The next morning, Julia met with Lucy Henderson, a local attorney who specialized in property law. The lawyer's office was warm and inviting, but Julia couldn't shake her unease as she shared the threatening note and explained Haven Ridge's situation. The good news is, you've already laid some strong groundwork, Lucy said, reviewing the sanctuary's documents. But we need to shore up your legal position. I'd recommend incorporating as a nonprofit and creating a formal board of directors. It'll make you harder to push around. While Julia worked on strengthening Haven Ridge's foundation, support from the community continued to pour in. Local businesses donated building materials, and volunteers helped repair fencing and clear overgrown paths. The sanctuary was slowly transforming, one improvement at a time. Apollo seemed especially attuned to Julia's stress during this period. Whenever she approached his paddock, he would walk over and rest his head on her shoulder, his presence steady and reassuring. His quiet strength helped ground her when worries threatened to overwhelm. That night, Julia sat at her desk reviewing paperwork. Donation records, volunteer schedules, and construction plans spread out before her. The magnitude of what she was trying to accomplish felt daunting in the darkness. Movement caught her eye, and she looked out the window. Apollo stood in his paddock, his white coat gleaming in the moonlight. He faced the sanctuary's entrance, as if standing guard. Julia pressed her hand against the cool glass. "We're not giving up," she whispered, drawing strength from Apollo's steadfast silhouette. Dark clouds rolled across the sky above Haven Ridge, casting ominous shadows over the sanctuary. Julia and her volunteers worked frantically to secure the property before the storm hit. Greg hammered boards across the barn windows while others moved hay bales to higher ground. "These support beams need reinforcing," Julia called out, her voice nearly lost in the rising wind. She watched anxiously as volunteers led the rescued ponies and donkey into the sturdy inner stalls. Apollo paced restlessly in his section of the barn, his hooves striking a nervous rhythm against the wooden floors. His ears twitched back and forth, and his whinnies grew more frequent and urgent. "I've never seen him this agitated," Greg said, wiping sweat from his forehead. The storm struck with surprising force. Rain hammered against the roof, while wind howled through every crack and crevice. Julia made regular rounds, checking on each animal as water began seeping under the barn doors. During one check, Apollo's urgent whinnying caught her attention. He stood at his stall door, head raised high, calling out with unusual intensity. Julia approached him, concerned by his behavior. "What is it, boy?" Apollo's cries grew more insistent. Following her instincts, Julia grabbed a flashlight and raincoat. She followed Apollo's direction toward the property line, where floodwaters were rising rapidly. Through the sheets of rain, Julia heard it, a weak cry barely audible above the storm. Her flashlight beam caught a glimpse of movement. There, Trapped against a fallen tree branch stood a terrified foal, the rising water already reaching its belly. "Greg!" Julia shouted into her radio. "I need help at the south fence line." But Apollo was already moving, somehow sensing the safest path through the flooding ground. Julia followed his sounds, carefully making her way to the struggling foal. The water pulled at her boots as she waded in, her heart pounding. The foal trembled as Julia approached. With gentle words and careful movements, she managed to free it from the branch. The small horse was weak, probably separated from its mother during the storm. Julia lifted it into her arms, its wet coat soaking through her raincoat. Apollo's steady whinnying guided them back through the darkness and driving rain. His calls acted like a beacon, leading them to safety as the storm raged around them. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a mess of scattered debris and muddy puddles. The foal lay wrapped in warm blankets in one of the inner stalls, accepting small sips of water from Julia's hands. Though exhausted, its eyes were bright and alert. Apollo stood in the neighboring stall, his head lowered toward the foal in a protective gesture. Julia reached out to stroke his neck, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. "You really are our guardian angel," she whispered, watching as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the barn windows, illuminating both horses in a gentle glow. Days after the storm, Julia sat in her lawyer's office, her hands trembling as she read through the documents spread across the desk. Lucy had uncovered a trail of suspicious payments and questionable permits linked to the developer trying to buy Haven Ridge's access road. "These records show clear evidence of bribery," Lucy explained, pointing to highlighted sections. "They've been paying off local officials to fast-track their projects and ignore environmental regulations." Julia's heart raced as she studied the papers. This is exactly what we need to stop them. Over the next few days, Julia and her team prepared their case for the town council. They gathered testimonials, organized their evidence, and rehearsed their presentations. Greg spent hours practicing his speech, determined to share how working at Haven Ridge had changed his life. The town hall was packed on the evening of the council meeting. Julia's hands were sweaty as she gripped her notes, watching familiar faces file into the room. Volunteers, local families, and even skeptics who'd become supporters filled the seats. When it was her turn to speak, Julia approached the podium with determination. She presented the evidence of the developer's misconduct, her voice growing stronger with each point. The council members leaned forward, their expressions serious as they examined the documents. Greg's testimony came next. His voice shook as he described abandoning Apollo after the fire, and how helping at Haven Ridge had given him a chance to make things right. "This place isn't just about saving animals," he said. "It's about saving people, too." Clara's testimony surprised everyone. She stood tall at the podium, her usual reserve replaced with passion. "I was wrong about Haven Ridge," she admitted. "What Julia and her team have accomplished in these few months has shown me the true value of my cousin Emma's legacy." One by one, community members shared stories of hope and healing found at Haven Ridge. Parents described how visiting the sanctuary had helped their children overcome fears. Local business owners talked about the positive impact on the community. The council's deliberation felt endless. Julia held her breath as the mayor stood to announce their decision. When he declared that Haven Ridge would be protected and the developer's plans rejected, the room erupted in cheers. Tears streamed down Julia's face as volunteers and supporters rushed to hug her. "You did it," Greg said, his own eyes wet with emotion. "We did it," Julia corrected him, looking around at the celebrating crowd. "All of us." With the legal victory secured, Julia threw herself into expanding Haven Ridge. Each morning brought new excitement as trucks delivered building materials and supplies. Volunteers arrived in waves carrying tools and wearing bright smiles as they tackled the renovation projects. The old barn transformed under their dedicated hands. Fresh red paint covered the weathered boards, while new windows let sunshine stream into the once dark interior. The paddocks expanded with sturdy new fencing, creating safe spaces for the growing number of rescued animals. In the central courtyard, volunteers planted flower gardens and installed benches, where visitors could sit and observe the sanctuary's residents. As word spread about Haven Ridge's revival, donations flowed in steadily. Local businesses contributed supplies, while families offered their time and skills. A retired carpenter helped design and build a covered arena for therapy sessions. A local gardening club created sensory gardens with herbs and soft grasses that animals and visitors could enjoy. The sanctuary quickly became the heart of the community. Children arrived after school for educational programs, learning about animal care and compassion. Veterans found peace working with the horses, while elderly visitors enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere and friendly company. Every weekend brought adoption events that united rescued animals with loving families. Apollo thrived in his role as Haven Ridge's mascot. Despite his blindness, he moved confidently through the sanctuary, greeting visitors with gentle nuzzles. Children were fascinated by his story, and adults marveled at his intuitive nature. He seemed to know exactly when someone needed comfort, often standing quietly beside upset or anxious visitors until they felt better. Clara's transformation was just as remarkable. She started spending more time at the sanctuary, helping Julia organize files and manage donations. During tours, she would share stories about Emma in the early days of Haven Ridge, her voice full of pride as she described her cousin's dedication to animal welfare. Emma would have loved seeing this, Clara often said, watching families interact with the animals. It's exactly what she dreamed of. The day of the grand reopening arrived with perfect weather. Sunshine bathed the freshly painted buildings as crowds gathered on the sanctuary grounds. Julia stood before the restored barn, her heart full as she watched familiar faces find seats for the ceremony. The highlight of the celebration was the unveiling of the memory wall inside the barn. Photos spanning Haven Ridge's history lined the walls, from Emma's early days to recent rescues. Letters from grateful families shared stories of hope and healing. In the center, a brass plaque gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the new windows. The words, "For her unwavering belief in second chances," captured Emma's spirit perfectly. People moved slowly along the wall, pointing out photos and sharing memories. Some wiped away tears, while others smiled at particularly touching stories. Apollo stood near the entrance, his presence a living bridge between Haven Ridge's past and present. The autumn breeze rustled through the newly planted gardens of Haven Ridge as Julia sat on a weathered wooden bench, watching Apollo graze peacefully with the other horses. The sanctuary had transformed from a neglected ghost of its former self into a thriving haven. Colorful flowers lined the pathways, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from the educational center where a group was learning about animal care. Clara approached, 2 steaming mugs of tea in her hands. She passed one to Julia and settled beside her on the bench. "I can hardly believe this is the same place," she said, her eyes taking in the scene before them. "When you first came here with Apollo's story, I thought you were chasing an impossible dream." "Sometimes I still have to pinch myself," Julia admitted, warming her hands on the mug. Clara touched Julia's arm gently. "Thank you for not giving up, for seeing what I couldn't see back then. Emma would have loved what you've done here." The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the paddocks as Julia reflected on their journey. She remembered the night Apollo arrived at her clinic, skeletal and blind, barely clinging to life. Now he moved with confidence, his coat gleaming as he guided newer rescues around the sanctuary. The old barn, once charred and crumbling, stood proud with its fresh paint and solid beams. Where weeds had choked the grounds, garden paths now wound between butterfly bushes and herb gardens. Families strolled the grounds, some leading newly adopted pets, while others participated in therapy sessions. Veterans worked with the horses in the training ring, their faces peaceful as they brushed coats and filled water troughs. The sanctuary had become more than just a safe place for animals. It was a community where healing happened every day. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Apollo lifted his head and nickered softly. The other horses gathered around him, following his lead as he made his way toward the paddock for the evening. Julia stood by the gate, marveling at how naturally he guided the herd despite his blindness. His ears swiveled toward her as he approached, and she reached out to stroke his neck. "You saved me as much as I saved you," she whispered as Apollo passed through the gate, his step sure and steady. The sanctuary spread out before her in the golden evening light. The restored barn, with its memory wall, the thriving gardens, the well-maintained paddocks, and the new educational center. Haven Ridge had become everything Emma had dreamed of and more, a living testament to the power of resilience and second chances. If you enjoyed the story of Apollo and Julia, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.